The numbers never lied to Michael Chen. Unlike words, which could be confusing and full of hidden meanings, numbers were pure, predictable, safe. 2 plus 2 would always equal 4, no matter who was asking or why or what they expected him to say. Numbers didn't judge him when he rocked back and forth, or avoided eye contact, or needed extra time to process what people were saying. At 16, Michael had been living with autism spectrum disorder his entire life, though the diagnosis hadn't come until he was 8. Before that, there had been years of confusion, frustration, and well-meaning adults trying to force him into neurotypical boxes that simply didn't fit. His parents, David and Susan Chen, had spent countless hours in therapy sessions, support groups, and educational meetings, learning how to help their son navigate a world that often seemed designed for everyone except him. Michael's relationship with language was complicated. He could read at a college level and write beautifully when given time, but verbal communication remained challenging, especially under pressure. In stressful situations, words would get tangled in his mind, like Christmas lights in a box, impossible to untangle quickly enough for normal conversation. This made school particularly difficult, despite his obvious intelligence. But with numbers, Michael was a different person entirely. He could calculate complex equations in his head faster than most people could use a calculator. He saw patterns in numerical sequences that others missed completely. He could memorize vast strings of digits and recall them perfectly days later. It was as if his brain, which struggled so much with the ambiguity of human language, found peace in the absolute certainty of mathematics. The Family Feud opportunity came through Michael's support group for teens with autism. The show was doing a special episode featuring families who had overcome challenges together, and someone had nominated the Chens. At first, Susan was hesitant. "I don't know if this is a good idea," she told David one evening, as they watched Michael arranging his collection of calculator displays in precise numerical order. "You know how he gets with crowds and loud noises. And all those cameras." David understood her concern. Michael's autism meant that unpredictable environments could be overwhelming. Too much sensory input could trigger what they called shutdowns, periods where Michael would withdraw completely, unable to communicate at all. But there was another side to consider. Michael had been working so hard in his social skills therapy, and he'd expressed genuine excitement when they'd told him about the invitation. He loved game shows, especially ones involving numbers and quick thinking. And perhaps most importantly, he'd asked if they could do it. "I want to try," Michael had said during one of their family discussions, his words careful and measured, as they always were when he was processing something important. "I want to show that I can help our family." That sentence had broken Susan's heart and filled it with pride. Simultaneously, Michael was so often the one being helped, being accommodated, being understood. The idea that he might be able to help them for once seemed to light something up inside him. They decided to go for it, with careful preparation. The producers were incredibly accommodating, allowing the family to visit the studio beforehand, so Michael could get familiar with the environment. They explained the game format multiple times, walked him through the physical space, and even let him practice with the buzzers. Michael had studied Family Feud episodes obsessively in the weeks leading up to their taping. He'd memorized the most common survey answers, calculated the statistical probabilities of various responses, and even created charts showing optimal game strategies. His preparation was thorough in a way that only someone with autism could achieve: complete, systematic, and absolutely exhaustive. The day of the taping, Michael wore his lucky blue shirt. Blue was calming and brought his fidget cube. Tactile stimulation helped with anxiety. The Chen family also included David's sister Amy and her teenage daughter Jessica, creating a team of 5 that represented different generations and personalities. Steve Harvey noticed Michael immediately during the pre-show warm-up. There was something about the young man's careful attention to detail, the way he observed everything with intense focus while avoiding direct eye contact, that suggested neurodivergence. Steve had worked with enough families over the years to recognize the signs. "Michael," Steve said during introductions, approaching him with the gentle energy he reserved for contestants who might need extra care. "How you feeling today?" young man. Michael looked at Steve's shoes instead of his face. A coping strategy his therapists had taught him. I'm experiencing moderate anxiety, but my preparation should compensate for any performance deficits, he said formally. Steve smiled. He'd heard lots of different ways people expressed nervousness, but Michael's clinical precision was both endearing and revealing. That's good thinking. You ready to help your family win some money? I have calculated that our team has a 73.6% probability of success based on demographic analysis of previous contestants and optimal answer strategies. Michael replied. Steve's eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. 73.6%? That's pretty specific. I don't round numbers unless absolutely necessary. Michael said seriously. Precision matters. The game began with the Chen family facing off against the Rodriguez family from San Antonio. Michael's parents had discussed strategy beforehand. They would handle most of the verbal interaction, while Michael would focus on the areas where his mathematical mind gave him an advantage. The first few rounds went well. David and Susan proved to be competitive players, while Amy contributed solid answers that kept their score climbing. Michael stood at the end of the podium, quietly observing, occasionally stimming with his fidget cube when the noise level got overwhelming. Steve noticed that Michael tracked every number on the board, his lips moving slightly as he calculated running totals in his head. During commercial breaks, the young man would whisper rapid calculations to his family members, updating them on score differentials and optimal strategies. Your son's like a human computer, Steve commented to Susan during one break. He's always been extraordinary with numbers, Susan replied proudly. It's his gift. But it was during the fourth round that Michael's unique abilities truly began to shine. The category was things that come in dozens, and the Chen family was behind by 47 points. They needed strong answers to stay competitive. Michael, David said, you want to try this one? Michael looked at the category, and for the first time all day, stepped forward to the podium. The studio lights felt bright, and the audience noise was overwhelming, but he focused on the familiar comfort of the numerical problem at hand. Name something that comes in dozens, Steve said, his voice gentler than usual. Michael's mind immediately began calculating. Dozens meant 12. What came in groups of 12? His brain sorted through possibilities with mechanical precision. Eggs, he said clearly. Good answer, Steve called out. Survey says. The board revealed it was the number one answer, worth. The Chen family erupted in celebration, but Michael barely noticed. He was still calculating, still processing the mathematical implications of their score change. Nice job, Michael, Steve said, walking over to give him a high five. Michael looked at Steve's approaching hand with uncertainty. Physical contact was difficult for him, especially unexpected contact. But Steve seemed to sense this and simply offered a thumbs up instead, which Michael could return without the pressure of touch. The game continued, with both families trading points back and forth. As they moved into the final rounds, the score remained close. The Chen family had pulled ahead by 12 points, but the Rodriguez family was fighting back hard. Then came Fast Money. Fast Money was Family Feud's final challenge. 2 family members had to answer 5 survey questions in a combined time limit, trying to score 200 points to win the $20,000 grand prize. David had volunteered to go first, and he'd scored a respectable 40 points. The Chen family needed 58 more points to win. Michael, Susan said, as they huddled during the commercial break, do you want to try Fast Money? Michael had been studying Fast Money rounds obsessively. He'd memorized the most statistically likely answers to hundreds of survey questions. His processing speed with numbers was incredibly fast. But Fast Money also meant standing alone on stage, with all the lights and cameras focused on him, while Steve rapid-fired questions that required immediate verbal responses. I can do the calculations, Michael said quietly. But the verbal processing under time pressure, you don't have to, David assured him. Amy can do it. But Michael looked at his family, his parents who had spent so many years helping him, advocating for him, believing in him, and made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. I want to try, he said. I want to help our family. Susan's eyes filled with tears. Amy squeezed his shoulder supportively, David nodded with pride. When they returned from commercial, Steve explained the rules again. Michael, you need 58 points to win $20,000 for your family. I'm going to ask you 5 questions. You need to give me the first answer that comes to your mind. Are you ready? Michael stood at the podium, his hands pressed flat against its surface to ground himself. The studio was quieter than usual. Even the audience seemed to sense that something special was happening. 20 seconds on the clock, Steve announced. Here we go. Name a number between 1 and 10. 7, Michael answered immediately. His brain had calculated that 7 was statistically the most popular choice in surveys. Good. Name something you might find in a teacher's desk. Pens. Another instant response based on his analysis of previous episodes. Name a reason you might be late for work. Traffic. Michael's preparation was paying off. Each answer came from his memorized database of optimal responses. Name something that flies. Birds. Simple, obvious, statistically sound. Name a month with 31 days. January. Michael's mathematical mind had immediately sorted the months with 31 days and selected the first one chronologically. Steve looked at Michael with amazement. The young man had answered all 5 questions in just 15 seconds, leaving 5 seconds unused, something that almost never happened in Fast Money. Michael, Steve said, that was the fastest fast money round I have ever seen. You ready to see how you did? Michael nodded, his hands still pressed against the podium for stability. Number between 1 and 10. You said 7. Survey says, the board revealed 25 points. 25. Good answer. The Chen family cheered. Michael had already scored almost half of what they needed. Something in a teacher's desk. You said pens? Survey says. 18 points appeared. 18 points. You're at 43. Michael's brain was automatically calculating. 58 minus 43 equals 15. They needed 15 more points from the last 3 answers. Reason you might be late for work, you said traffic. Survey says. The board showed 32 points. 32. You're at 75 points. You already won. The studio erupted. The Chen family was screaming with joy. The audience was on their feet, and confetti began falling from the ceiling, but Michael stood frozen at the podium, overwhelmed by the sensory explosion around him. Steve noticed immediately. Instead of joining the celebration, he walked over to Michael and spoke quietly, just loud enough for his microphone to pick up. Michael, he said gently, you just saved your family. You know that? Michael looked up at Steve for the first time all day, making brief eye contact. I calculated the optimal responses based on statistical analysis of previous survey data, he said, his voice clinical even in the midst of triumph. Steve smiled, but there was something deeper in his expression. Michael, can I tell you something? Michael nodded. I've been hosting this show for years. I've seen a lot of smart people, a lot of quick thinkers, but what you just did, that wasn't just smart, that was special. You have a gift. Numbers are my superpower, Michael said simply, using a phrase his therapist had taught him to help explain his abilities to others. The words hit Steve like a physical force. Here was a young man who had been told his entire life that he was different, that he needed help, that he struggled with things others found easy. But in this moment, his differences had become strengths. His unique brain had saved the day. You're not just different, Michael, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. You're gifted, and your family is lucky to have you. By now, the rest of the Chen family had reached the podium. Susan was crying as she hugged her son. David was beaming with pride, and Amy was telling anyone who would listen that her nephew was a genius. But Steve wasn't finished. He turned to address the studio audience. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, I want you to understand what just happened here. Michael has autism. For him, being on this stage, with all these lights and noise and pressure, that took incredible courage. But he didn't just participate, he excelled. He showed us that being different doesn't mean being less. It means being special in a different way. The applause that followed was different from typical game show applause. It was recognition, appreciation, respect for something profound that had just occurred. Steve looked back at Michael, who was still processing the overwhelming success of his performance. Michael, I need to ask you something. How does it feel to be the hero of your family today? Michael considered the question with his characteristic precision. It feels optimal, he said finally. For once, my differences were advantages instead of obstacles. The honesty of his response, the simple, mathematical way he described his emotional experience, moved everyone in the studio to tears. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his business card. Michael, I want you to have this. Not because you won money, but because you taught everyone here something important today. You taught us that there are many different kinds of intelligence, many different ways to be brilliant. Michael took the card and studied it carefully, as if memorizing every detail. Thank you, Mr. Harvey. This has been a statistically significant positive experience. Steve laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that comes from deep affection and amazement. Then he did something unprecedented. He removed his suit jacket. Michael, he said, this jacket has been with me through thousands of shows, but today, you earned it. You showed courage, you used your gifts to help your family, and you reminded all of us that different doesn't mean less, it means special. He draped the jacket over Michael's shoulders. It was enormous, on the teenager's slight frame, but Michael wore it with visible pride. The image that was captured in that moment, Michael standing at the Family Feud podium, wearing Steve Harvey's oversized jacket, his family surrounding him with love and pride, his face showing a rare, genuine smile, became one of the most shared photos in the show's history. The episode aired 8 weeks later and immediately went viral. The hashtag #NumbersAreMySuperpower began trending, with people sharing stories of neurodivergent family members and their unique gifts. Autism advocacy organizations used Michael's appearance as an example of the importance of recognizing and celebrating neurodiversity. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other families. With autistic children, thousands of parents wrote to share how Michael's success had given their children confidence, had shown them that their differences could be strengths, had reminded them that there were many ways to be brilliant. Michael returned to school as something of a celebrity, but more importantly, he returned with a new sense of confidence in his abilities. His math teachers began incorporating more of his interests into their lessons, and he started tutoring other students who struggled with numerical concepts. The $20,000 the family won was put into a college fund for Michael, who had decided he wanted to study mathematics and computer science. But the real prize was something money couldn't buy: the knowledge that his unique mind was valuable, that his differences were gifts, that he could be a hero too. Steve Harvey kept his promise to stay in touch with the family. Every few months, he would call to check on Michael's progress, always asking about his latest mathematical discoveries or academic achievements. How are those numbers treating you? Superpower, Steve would ask. They remain consistent and reliable, Michael would respond, and both of them would laugh. 1 year later, Michael was invited to speak at an autism awareness conference. Standing at the podium in a room full of families, advocates, and researchers, he wore the jacket Steve had given him, now altered to fit properly, but still recognizable. I used to think my autism was something wrong with me, he told the audience, his voice stronger and more confident than it had been on Family Feud. But I learned that being different isn't about being broken, it's about being uniquely capable of things others cannot do. He paused, looking out at the audience with more direct eye contact than he'd ever managed before. Numbers are my superpower, he continued, but they're not my only power. I also have the power to show people that neurodiversity is valuable, that different kinds of minds solve different kinds of problems, and that the world needs all of us exactly as we are. The standing ovation that followed was thunderous. But Michael didn't cover his ears or rock back and forth as he might have a year earlier. Instead, he smiled and waved, comfortable in his own skin, in a way that seemed impossible just months before. Today, Michael Chen is a senior in high school, maintaining a 4.0 GPA and preparing for college. He's the captain of his school's math team, a peer tutor for students with learning differences, and an advocate for autism awareness in his community. The jacket from Steve Harvey hangs in his bedroom, But he still wears it to special occasions, graduation ceremonies, academic competitions, speaking engagements. It's become a symbol, not just of his success on Family Feud, but of his journey toward self-acceptance and confidence. And in his room, next to the jacket, hangs a framed photo from that day, Michael at the Fast Money podium, his family cheering behind him, Steve Harvey looking at him with pride and amazement. Below the photo is a quote that Michael wrote himself: "Different doesn't mean less, it means I have abilities. Others don't. Numbers are my superpower. But self-acceptance is my greatest strength." Because sometimes the most important victories aren't about winning money or games. They're about discovering that the things that make you different are exactly the things that make you extraordinary.